Hello and welcome back to this our 24th live stream, the 24 Thrones. On these live streams, we take your questions on ancient Egypt and the Bible. And same as always, what we do is we technical difficulties. We take your questions, and as always, super chats have priority. If you're going to ask a non-super chat question, that's fine. We do enjoy taking non-super chats as well. So this is not just for people who donate to the channel. We'll take non-super chat questions as well, but super chats do have priority. Now, if you are doing a non-super chat, I ask that you put a Q and a colon in front of the question so I know that it's directed specifically to me. This helps me to know that it is oriented to me and not somebody else in the live stream, in the live chat. Also, I also ask that you only post your question once so I can quickly scan through the list and see what I haven't taken. I also would request that if you reference something like a foreign word or something in a Bible passage, include the passage or what you think the word means, so I have a little bit of context to assist me in answering the questions. So with that, we're going to get into it. The reference to the 24 thrones comes from the thrones of the 24 elders that are mentioned in Revelation 4:4 and 11:16. Now, nobody is really sure who the 24 elders are. There's a lot of commentaries out there that have some good guesses. One guess is that it's, say, the elders of the 12 tribes of Israel plus the 12 apostles, the 12 true apostles. But nobody really knows. We're only sort of guessing at who the 24 elders are. But they are seated before the throne of Christ. So they do appear a couple times in the book of Revelation. So we've decided to name this live stream after the 24 elders of the book of Revelation. So with that said, let's start getting into the questions. Now, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take at least one non-super chat before we begin here. So I'm loading up the live chat here. And, okay, I'm going to take this one first from DN Salzar. The question is, thoughts on claims of Judaic monotheism being stolen from Zoroastrianism. Okay, I don't think much of it at all, frankly, because Zoroastrianism is not monotheism. Zoroastrianism is essentially a dualism. There's a good god and an evil god, and essentially it's a sort of a struggle between the two. So Zoroastrianism is not monotheist. Zoroastrianism is basically a ditheism. So it's not the same. I also would say that Zoroastrianism developed a lot later than Judaic monotheism. Now, Judaic monotheism has its roots in, say, the Ten Commandments. And this is one of the reasons why we're doing the current video series on the Ten Commandments, is because the Ten Commandments are really seminal to the development of monotheism. You really can't have the monotheism without Ten Commandments. Monotheism more or less collapses out of that milieu of late Bronze Age religious thought because of how the Sinai law code is structured. And again, not to sort of do too many spoilers here, but it's going to become very, very apparent how the orthopraxis, that is the right doing of Israelite religion, plays into the orthodoxy or right thinking. So just that's a little teaser for the upcoming video, which should be Monday. But that gives you some insight into the true origins of Judaic monotheism. Zoroastrianism does influence Israelite religion, and it really does respond in several sections to it, but I don't think it's formative. I don't think there's any direct stealing here involved. So anyway, thank you very much for the non-super chat. It's an interesting question. Okay. See, anything else that I can just sort of...
Milton Cookie says, does anyone know what denomination he is? Can I type in yes?
Milking Cookies asks, does anyone know what denomination he is? Some people know. Some people aren't telling.
Can I just type in yes?
You can guess. I won't confirm or deny. But I have only a couple questions I just won't answer. And one question I just won't answer is what denomination I am. I will tell you I'm an evangelical Christian, and I'll leave it at that. Okay? But thank you for the question. Okay, now we've answered 2 non-super chats. We're now going to get into the super chats. Now, our first super chat comes from Neonow for, I hope I'm going to try to pronounce this currency correctly, for 25 Polish złotki, or sorry, złoty. I don't know Polish, so it's 25 złoty. Thank you very much for the super chat. It's a very interesting question. I have to admit, when I got this question, it put a big smile on my face, because it's now we're getting into speculative religion, and this is interesting stuff. And the question is, if we were to confirm the existence of aliens, would it cause any theological problems? I myself don't see how, but people keep saying it would. Okay. It's really going to depend on what your theology is. For example, a American young Earth creationism it's going to create a lot of problems here. Part of it is because American young Earth creationism does sort of see the creation of the Earth as the central event of the universe. So anything outside of that central event in the physical universe is going to sort of wreak havoc with that theology. There's also going to be a notion of, say, the centrality of the consequences of original sin. So if your view is that original sin caused the whole universe to fall, but also all corporeal beings to need a savior, then yes, that's going to be a theological problem. And the reason why it's going to be a theological problem is because of a doctrine called federative responsibility. Now, what federative responsibility is the idea that when Adam fell, all his descendants became responsible for his sin and fell along with him. Extraterrestrials being outside of the genetic line of Adam would, under this rubric of federative responsibility, have the effects of sin, but no way to be redeemed from them, because they're not in the line of Adam. Now, there's if we shift this theology a bit to, say, the idea that, sin may corrupt the universe, but not everyone is responsible for it. Sort of the idea that when Adam fell, the universe, started feeling the effects of sin, but not necessarily its responsibility. then this is not so much a theological problem. The other factor too we have to keep in mind is that if extraterrestrials do exist, they would conceivably be under the creation as the part of the heavenly host. The idea that, you know, that there are other beings out there besides just what happens here on planet Earth. So I don't see that there's a major theological problem here. There's a minor theological problem for some forms of theology, but by no means all of them. So it's really going to depend upon what is your theological stance and how rigidly you're going to hold to that theological stance. But prima facie, there's no problem with it per se. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Thank you very much for the question. It was a fascinating question. I have thought about this. I think about this on for years because, you know, I'm very interested in science fiction. For me, the what if possibility here, I think, is very interesting. So with that said, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Now, I hope I don't butcher this name because there's no vowels in here, so I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. So, please forgive me if I butcher it badly. A $25 super chat from Bra Macaire. Again, there's a dozen ways I could pronounce this. I know I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Okay. He asks, on the stela of Erectisen, the scribe claims his secrets were only to be known by his eldest son. Was this customary during the Exodus? If so, is there evidence of a loss of knowledge in Egypt abruptly after the 10th plague? Okay. We see this more along the lines of two sort of instances. We do see this in, say, secrets of, say, priests. So, like secret rituals, that sort of thing. So we do see that here. The whole idea of secrets is very interesting in Egyptian culture, because when an Egyptian inscription talks about secrets, it's usually talking about religious secrets. Secret rituals, secret incantations, secret knowledge. There's a chamber underneath most temples where the most private rituals were done. And this was called the Chamber of Secrets. So there is actually a real Chamber of Secrets in Egyptian temples, which is very fascinating. The famous Dendera light bulb is beneath Dendera Temple in its Chamber of Secrets. So it's fascinating to be able to actually go and actually see this. And in my book, I have actually I took a photograph of that chamber. So beautiful. I mean, it's just beautiful alabaster workmanship down there. Just beautiful stuff. But yes, this idea that the father would pass his knowledge to the firstborn son, who would inherit his position. Because one of the things we see in, say, Egypt is that the firstborn son not only inherits most of the stuff, but they also inherit the job. So if your father was high priest and you were the firstborn son, essentially the heir designate, you would also inherit that job, and you would fill that role once your father passed away. So that's why the secrets were passed down to the eldest son. So this was very, very common throughout all periods of Egyptian history. This is how just things were done. Now, the second part of your question, if so, is there evidence of a loss of knowledge in Egypt abruptly after the 10th plague? No, and here's the reason why. Because of the second son, usually. Egypt had such a high mortality rate amongst, say, children, and that it was never people never put all their eggs in one basket, because mortality was just so high. It was just so high in ancient Egypt. So if the firstborn son died, it was usually expected that the second son would be taking over, because the second son now becomes the heir designate. So we don't see a huge loss of knowledge here, just because that there's sort of time to recover. But then again, too, our knowledge of religious mysteries in all periods of time is kind of scant. We don't actually have a lot of information on this. So there's not a lot of records that we can go back and consult to see if there was. So we don't see it, but that might be just because we don't have the evidence to see it. So again, we don't notice it, but that's not because it isn't happening. It's because we just don't have the sort of the foundational evidence, the textual evidence we need to make that determination one way or the other. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for that very generous super chat. Very much appreciated. Thank you very much. Okay. And we got another super chat here from Theologia. Or Theologia. Try to get my accent right here. For $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. Is there evidence of new Israelite settlement and culture in Canaan after the conquest? Would we even expect such evidence? Okay, now, the primary evidence that we have for Israelite culture and settlement in Canaan is actually two. Essentially, the presence of Israelite pottery and faunal remains. Those are the two sort of key, sort of distinctive pieces of evidence that show Israelites' culture in Canaan. Now, the fact is that Israelite pottery is a little late on the scene. It starts sort of forming. We start seeing it. The burnishware, the Israelite burnishware, happens at around, say, the end of the 12th century. And we actually see a change in faunal remains happening earlier than that. So roughly 1150, say the mid-12th century BC, we start finding a change in faunal remains. Now, basically, these are the remains of animals that have been either eaten or sacrificed. And we do see the shift from, and the shift is actually mentioned, I believe, in Richard Hess's book, where we see a change from, say, fallow deer, donkey sacrifices, and swine remains, to sheep and goat sacrifices. We still see the faunal deer to some extent, but that starts to taper off. But we start seeing, say, a change in faunal remains from that turn away from donkey and swine. So we start seeing that around 1150 BC. We see this all across the Judean foothills, and it's very interesting. If you map it out, it very much almost follows the same sort of pattern of Israel before it occupies, say, the new nation of Israel, the modern nation of Israel, almost overlaps that. So it's very interesting that the territory of modern Israel is not that much different from, say, ancient Israel. But we see this change primarily confined to the Judean foothills. So if you can imagine, say, a map of modern Israel, there's this sort of section in the center. You got the coastal plain, you got the Philistine cities there. You don't see change of faunal remains there. North of the Jezreel Valley, you see the Neo-Hittite states. You don't quite see the faunal remains change there. To the northeast, you've got Aram, and then the cousin nations of Edom, Ammon, and Moab. So you get this sort of Israelite chunk in the center where we see this shift in faunal remains. So we do see evidence of this. Okay? So there is a change, at least in diet, if nothing else. So that's that's probably about all we're going to expect to see out of this, because one of the things is we now sort of understand that the Israelites weren't, in their conquest, weren't coming in and destroying cities. They weren't doing that. They were occupying them. So they're occupying them, they're taking over the buildings, and then eventually they're starting to, at some point, they start to decide to mow down those buildings and then build new ones. And that's sort of when we start seeing more substantial occupation of Israel as the promised land. So we start seeing that sort of move to say, make the cities their own, as opposed to just occupying the Canaanite cities. We see that around, say, the very extreme late Bronze Age to early Iron One. So that's when we start seeing, that Israel starts really making its presence known. Before then, they're just occupying existing Canaanite cities, eating their food, pressing their oil, their olive oil groves. They're just taking over. They're not destroying anything as such. So then, and this is one of the classic problems with archaeology. If things don't get destroyed, we can't see them. Because a lot of archaeology is just trying to identify destruction layers and trying to make sense of history through destruction layers. And when they're not destroying things, it makes it harder to identify. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Okay,
Dragon of the Mississippi River. It's free up.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that. What?
Dragon of the Mississippi Rat for $2 chat.
Okay. Okay, I see that. Okay. Let me get that here. All right. The Dragon of the Mississippi River for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. And now I'll find the question here. Okay. Okay. Question. Is Adam's third son, Seth, a representation of the Egyptian god Set as part of the polemic against polytheism? I asked because they have similar etymology and might help to explain the Nephilim. Okay. No. That's sort of the short, that's the high level answer to the question. Seth and Set are not related. I know there are people that have tried to make that etymology. We even find this in say late antiquity, in say some certain Gnostic myths, where they've tried to tie Seth and the Egyptian god Set, but they're not related in any way. For one thing, the Egyptian god Set is a storm god. He's a storm god. And he comes out of, say, the earliest, say, the pre-dynastic period of Egypt is where we start seeing his myth form. And he's actually the god of Lower Egypt. He's sort of the titular god of Lower Egypt. Now, Seth was the Egyptian, the biblical portrayal of Seth is not as a storm god. And really not even as, say, a bad person. So there's really no polemic in the biblical text here. When the Bible tries to present a polemic, it's usually pretty clear about this. Now, for those not familiar with the story of Adam's children, the Cain and Abel narrative. Basically, what happens is you have Cain and Abel born. Cain brings his sacrifice, his offering of vegetables. God is apparently not a vegetarian because he rejects that offering. And Abel, who offers a blood sacrifice, is accepted. Cain loses face before God, and then Cain slays Abel. This loss of a son essentially distresses Eve, and she conceives and bears Seth as a replacement for a son for Abel. So that's what's going on in the biblical narrative here. So this is not a polemic against polytheism. What it is it's the establishment of a separate line of humanity. The whole setup here is more or less, we got a new clan. We got a new clan. We got a new line of clans. So you're going to have essentially in the pre-flood narrative, you're going to have two lines of clans. You're going to have a clan of Cain and his posterity and the bad stuff that happens from that. Ugh. And then you have, say, the more righteous clan of Seth that is going to try to be more faithful, but still can't hold that status quo. So that's really what's going on here, is you have a competition of clans and the effects of sin, and how those effects of sin are going to affect both the unrighteous and the righteous clans. Nobody gets off scot-free here. Nobody comes out looking good. But that's the polemic here. The polemic is against sin, not against polytheism. Now, I have to admit, I like Heiser's view of the Nephilim, but I think it's an incomplete picture. I think there's a lot more going on with the Nephilim than just that it's, say, giants. I think there's a lot more going on here. I think this works into concepts such as naditum, vows of priesthoods, and say celibacy for ritual purposes within those priesthoods. So there's a lot of extra cultural context that I think is missing from Heiser's interpretation of the Nephilim. But I also think that he's got something here, that there is actually a mythological undercurrent that in many respects, say, this idea of the sons of God and the Nephilim are, alluding to this idea of, say, watchers and the sons of God being sort of proxy deities. So this is one of those areas where I think Heiser is half right. I think he's half right. And I think he's really, I think there's some things he's got. He nailed the head bang on, absolutely bang on. But I think there's more going on here too with his text. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. A $24 super chat from 501 Mobius. Thank you very much. Good to see you here tonight. No question, just to support this channel. Well, thank you very much. We do really much appreciate your support. We appreciate all the super chats. It really helps us to keep things going. As you all might have heard, our camera died. Very inconvenient, I can tell you. So this helps us to replace that camera. So it is going directly into helping us produce this channel. So again, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Wow. Very generous super chat here from sinaiticus Apologia for $100. Thank you very much. Very, very generous. Thoughts on the Canaanite god El and Yahweh being the same, or the notion that the Israelites combine El and Yahweh over time? Okay. Wow. That's an interesting question, and there's going to be a lot of nuance here. Now, one of the things about El, we do find El in the Ugaritic lecture, mythologies. Okay, El seems to be El is a couple things. There's a couple things we need to know about the term El in general. El is both a name and a noun. Okay? It's both a proper noun and a common noun, if we can use, say, more English grammatical terms. Okay? In its common noun sense, El just means God or a god. Okay? So that's what it means in, say, its common everyday sense. But it's also a proper noun. And it's the noun that the proper noun is a name. It's the name of the chief god of the Ugaritic pantheon. So in the Ugaritic pantheon, you have the father god, the head god. He's named El, and under him are lesser gods such as Baal. So you've got that going on here. So it's both a generic term and a name. Now, Yahweh is different. It comes out of a verb that means to be. And it uses a vowel pattern that we find very, very often in, say, Akkadian. So we do find references to Yahweh, that seem to preserve that pattern. It's a very ancient linguistic pattern. It's a linguistic pattern we don't often see in, say, West Semitic languages like Hebrew, but we do find it in East Semitic languages like Akkadian. So it's sort of clear, and we also have to throw one other thing into the mix too, which is Elohim. Elohim is both a plural of El, so it means gods, or it is the magnificent plural, which we also find in Hebrew. The magnificent plural meaning it's amplified. So it's like when the angels say, holy, holy, holy. The triplicate amplifies the holiness. It's emphasis through repetition. So we do have references to, say, King David as the Melachim, the great king. So we have this reference to Elohim as the great God. So we can't always be sure if Elohim is God's plural or the great God. So there does seem to be in, say, this sort of overlap between, say, the Canaanite god meaning of El and Yahweh. So we can't really be sure about, say, the direct connotation of the terminology here, but it's also true that just because we find El in the biblical text, that it is not necessarily descended from the Canaanite god El, just because of its generic term in Semitic languages in general. I doubt that it was something that was combined over time. Again, I think this is one of those things where El is both a proper and a common noun. So I think that really sort of, it doesn't really satisfy anything. So we can't really say that the one descended from the other. But we also have to recognize, too, that Semitic languages do have common roots. And because of those common roots, El is just common Semitic. You find it in almost every Semitic language. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. I hope it brings some clarity to the issue. Again, scholarship is still developing on this, so hopefully we'll get more answers over time. Anyway, thank you very much for that extremely generous super chat. Very much appreciated. It does help us out tremendously. Okay, another super chat from Theologia for $4.99. Thank you very much for this super chat. Unrelated to Egyptology, what are your thoughts on the authorship of Isaiah? Most scholars think it is from multiple authors. Any evidence against this? Yes. Wow. Yes. there is some evidence to this. Now, the idea here for the multiple authorship of Isaiah is the idea that we have a I forget where the dividing line here is in Isaiah, but that the first half of Isaiah, often called Isaiah 1, is one author. And then the second part of Isaiah, often called Isaiah 2, is another author. And the basis of this analysis is repetition. The idea that much of Isaiah 2 seems to repeat or copy Isaiah 1. Now, there was a commentary. I think it was the word commentary, but don't quote me on this. It was generally perceived as a scholarly, not a terrific commentary. But there was one very, very interesting point from this commentary on the authorship of Isaiah. And that was the idea of poetic reflection. And what that particular commentator, one of the reasons why this commentary was so panned was it didn't follow, say, the tradition of commentaries. Now, the dirty secret of commentaries is that every commentary copies every other commentary. So you fall into this pattern of commentary writing where you have to reference every other commentary to write a new commentary, and say you'll get sort of these tracks of thought in commentaries. And this is why you see so much Talmudic literature quoted in commentaries, is because people aren't veering away from Talmudic literature. They're just copying what the previous commentary said. So since previous commentaries, said that you have two Isaiahs, Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2, they sort of followed that line of reasoning. But this author, whose name I can't remember, suggested that what you have here in Isaiah is two books written as chiasm. The idea that it leads to a pinnacle and then reflects its previous Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2. So it's a very provocative theory. It's very interesting. And it's very interesting because we do see some of this in Second Temple literature, where for, say, literary effect, they're doing, say, a chiasm of an entire book. So there's it's a very provocative theory. Very few scholars accept it, but I think it has merit. I really do think it has merit that we can sort of see in Isaiah an intentional reflection of Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2. So if that does hold out, that sort of attacks the idea of multiple authorship. So again, which way does the evidence go is really ultimately what I'm going to follow here. So I haven't looked at this issue closely enough to make a full determination, but right now I'm much more leaning towards the reflection argument than I am towards the multiple authorship argument. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, I got a $10 RON now. I don't know that currency. But I do appreciate the super chat. Very much appreciate it. From Crucero Benny. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Did Amenhotep III use Avaris as a summer residence? Ooh. Okay. Well, we got to kind of understand what we mean by royal palaces here, because there's a lot of confusion about royal palaces and what they were used for in ancient Egypt. It is true that during the reign of Amenhotep II, the Tutmosis III's royal palace was temporarily abandoned through the reign of, say, Tutmosis IV, but was reoccupied by Amenhotep III. Now, what that actually means is going to... The thing is, there are royal palaces all over Egypt. Okay? Not just at Avaris. We find them at Memphis. We find them as far south as Aswan. There are royal palaces all over Egypt. And the reason why we find them all over Egypt is they're not necessarily summer residences. Now, the way sort of the rulership of Dynasty 18 worked is the king spent most of his time at Thebes. That's where he spent most of his time. That's where the harem was. That's where the royal court was. That's where all the ambassadors were. That was your religious seat of power. That was also the tribal homeland of the Theban. Because remember, we're dealing with a society that's tribal. Egypt, for all its unification, was still a tribal society. And kings had their power base where their home tribe lived. For the 18th dynasty, that homeland was Thebes, the Theban nome. So the kings of Dynasty 18 did not stray far from Thebes for any long period of time, because they wouldn't have the same power base. It just opened themselves up for, say, being usurped. Because the fact is, all you'd have to do to overthrow the king is essentially, take over the royal palace at Thebes, cuckold the harem, and that would show the weakness of the king, and then his power would fall pretty fast. So the king never strayed far from Thebes. Now, the king had to say, very, very occasionally, and we don't even know how often he did this, but we do have records of the king during a tour of Egypt from its northern to southern extremities, where he would visit temples and do the ritual, I'm the high priest of all of Egypt, at every temple he visited. And the royal residences served as, when he went on this tour of Egypt, this religious tour of Egypt, it would serve as sort of his basically home away from home. So it had a small contingent of armed soldiers. It had a place he could sleep, but it was very rarely used by the king. It was very rarely used. What these royal palaces were served as most of the time was, say, as administrative centers for regional governors. Nomarchs would sometimes use them as their royal palaces. Viziers would often use them as say, their royal, basically where they administered everything. So that was the most common use for these residences, was as, say, the administrative centers. Now, part of the reason why the summer residence at Avaris was abandoned had to do with the fact that Amenhotep II pulled his vizier in, say, in the delta from Avaris and situated him in Memphis. So that's much of the reason why that palace was abandoned. But during the reign of Amenhotep III, it's very clear that it was once again reoccupied. So, again, summer residence, probably not. Did he stay there occasionally? Yeah, probably. Basically, when he did his ritual tour of Egypt, and most likely when he visited the Temple of Baal. So, as high priest of all of Egypt, he would have invariably visited the Temple of Baal, performed his offerings there, and then sort of moved on to the next destination. So anyway, I hope that explains it. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. It's from Romania. Oh, cool. Awesome. So thank you very much again. I'm glad you just decided to join us tonight. Okay. All right. 499 super chat from CNMK. Why reject the documentary hypothesis? I heard J&A interwoven explains the confusing parts in Joseph's soul narrative. It's two stories combined. Okay. I reject the documentary hypothesis because I don't think the evidence supports it. Honestly. That's the reason I reject it. I reject it primarily because I think the evidence is stronger in another direction. Now, we have to understand that in many respects, the documentary hypothesis is an ad hoc hypothesis. It's the elements that are used to make the determinations of J, P, E, and D are elements that wouldn't show any other distinctions in any other ancient Near Eastern text. I mean, let's just take the confusing parts of, say the Joseph Soul narrative. In that, the people who advocate the documentary hypothesis are going to say, well, it was the Ishmaelites who sold Joseph in one, but the Midianites who sold him in the other. Well, this sort of betrays an ignorance of what late Bronze Age Midian looked like. You had, say, the Ishmaelites living in the land of Edom. Well, during the late Bronze Age, the Midian stretched from the basically Saudi Arabia through Edom and into the Sinai Peninsula. In the late Bronze Age, the toponymic range of Midian was much greater than it was, say, later on in the Iron Age. So it's a synonym, essentially. So again, I think this is really sort of there's almost baked into the documentary hypothesis an assumption that these have got to be late writings. So because the assumption is sort of baked into the theory, you're going to get the result you look for. So I just don't see that the evidence that they use to justify the documentary hypothesis really supports the conclusion. So it's really an evidential matter for me. So that's why I'm not buying it. Because I think there are better explanations of the text. I don't like the reasoning behind it. Things that they use to make these distinctions of authorship, I just don't make any sense. The idea that a single text that has, say, a narratival and then a poetic section is obviously the result of two authors. Well, the Merneptah Stela has that. We know it's one author on that. So, you can't apply the same standard to other ancient Near Eastern texts. It makes no sense. So it's a matter of evidence. It's a matter purely of evidence, and I'm going to follow the evidence. So that's my view on why I reject the documentary hypothesis. And I think there's other things too that contribute to this problem as well, such as the presence of 19th dynasty vocabulary in, say, the Pentateuch. There's other things as well, but that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg here. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, $5 super chat from Christopher Larson. Thank you very much for the super chat. Could you comment on the Labyrinth of Egypt? Ooh. Herodotus has called it as impressive as the pyramids of Giza. Any excavations going on? Wow. Yes, there is actually. How do I say this? Egyptian scholars do believe that there was a labyrinth connected to one of the sun temples of Egypt. And a lot of Egyptologists think that Herodotus got this idea of the labyrinth of Egypt from the Sun Temples. Now, what are the Sun Temples? In Dynasty 5, what we get is a period of kings that are not only building for themselves pyramids, but essentially these places of private worship out in the desert. So what they're doing is they're building these complex temples that have raised platforms and essentially obelisks in worship of the sun god Re. And these are called sun temples. Now, we know from records that there were at least 7 sun temples built. And of those, we have found the remains of 2 of those sun temples. But very, very interesting, one of those sun temples seems to have this weird labyrinthine structure that's associated with it. It's on the outskirts of it. And nobody really knows why it is. It's there. It's not down deep. It's sort of on the surface. And it's sort of scattered stones. But there does seem to be a wall-like structure that seems to have a kind of a maze to it. So, I don't think there's any current excavations going on in there. But it has been noted by Egyptologists. So we do see something like this. So everyone is right now thinking that that's sort of what Herodotus was referring to when it talks about the labyrinth of Egypt, is that sun temple. Now, we don't know how long that cultic service went on. After Dynasty 5, Egyptian kings stopped building sun temples. It was really something that was peculiar to Dynasty 5. But the structure would have inevitably remained for a long time. So, it is very interesting. I'll grant that. That one's very interesting. So I think that's what's going on there. Hey, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. I hope that answers that question. Great question. Okay. Jared Gilmore for $24. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you have any thoughts on Göbekli Tepe? Do you think it indicates agrarian civilization earlier than 8000 BC? Okay, I'll say this right now. I have a very, very good friend who is a prehistoric Anatolian archaeologist. Good friend. When I have questions about Anatolian archaeology, I bounce them off of her, because I'm not a subject matter expert on this. But from what I understand of Göbekli Tepe, it is very old. It is very, very old. 8000 BC is not an unreasonable estimate for Göbekli Tepe. I do think there does seem to be a strong indication that Göbekli Tepe did spring up around an agrarian society. And some of that is because we do find, say, floral remains of grains, lentils. We also find, like, chickpeas, for example. We find the floral remains of chickpeas there. We also have discovered from, say, isotopic analysis of some of the skeletons there that they had a mostly agrarian diet. So we do find that, say, around Göbekli Tepe and into all of Anatolia. This isn't just confined to Göbekli Tepe, but all around, say, Anatolia, around 8000 BC, we do find the beginning of the domestication of grains. So we find that barley gets its start there, emmer wheat gets its start there, chickpeas gets its start there, even lentils seem to get gets its start there. So we find the say the genesis of all these different staple grains and legumes sort of get a foothold. The people of Anatolia seem to be doing a lot of experimental agriculture for basically essentially the first time in human history. So I think that's a very interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of Göbekli Tepe, and we're only starting getting the sort of the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, it is a cult center. We can tell it's a cult center. You know, it's got animal glyphs. It's got totems. It has that sort of presence of very, very ancient ritual culture. So those are my thoughts on goldbecky tepe. Again, not an expert on this. It's not my field of expertise. I'll freely admit that. I might have completely got that totally wrong, but that's as far as I know about it. As I say, if I have questions on this, I go to my good friend, and she will tell me, because this is her wheelhouse. But anyway, thank you very much for the very generous super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Theologia again for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thoughts on the ketum amulets? Can they be used as evidence of the antiquity of the Torah? Oh wow. Yes, I have thoughts on the ketum amulets. Now, for those not familiar with the ketum amulets, they're essentially two silver phylactery scrolls. Now, a phylactery is essentially a little tiny piece of scroll that's usually contained in a box that is worn on the forehead like an amulet. Now, this was a tomb that was actually excavated from under a church in Jerusalem. So these were found in situ. The tomb dates to roughly the 7th century, so 7th century BC. So slightly before, say, the reign of Josiah. So this is definitely during the divided monarchy. So it's after the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria, and before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Now, they do contain quotes from, I believe, the book of Exodus and Numbers, but don't quote me on that. I'm not sure of it. One of it is a variant. One of them is a variant. One of them is really more or less a direct quote of the Torah. Now, here's the interesting thing I see when I hear about, say, debates about the antiquity of the Torah. There does seem to always be, say, this sort of skeptical approach of saying, oh, well, you know, the Torah was just passed orally. And basically, you know, the ketum, you know, is just more or less, you know, or that part of that oral transmission of the Torah. But it does seem to sort of raise the uncomfortable question, well, if it's written down on a phylactery scroll, no matter how small that scroll is it really oral tradition anymore? It's at that point, it's written tradition. You know, you can still raise the question of whether it was redacted at that point, but you can't no longer raise the question of whether it's an oral transmission. At that point, it's a written tradition. So, yes, I do think it's very much evidence for the antiquity of the Torah, and I think any attempt to try to say, well, you know, we don't have it in, you know, it's you have no evidence until the Babylonian exile. I think that's complete poppycock. Complete poppycock. So we pretty much know at this point, at least I think the evidence here is overwhelming that at least as far as the antiquity of the Torah is concerned, that we have direct evidence for it, dating at least to the 7th century BC. If you go into linguistic arguments, the antiquity can be traced right back to, say, the 12th or 13th century BC. So I think there's a lot of good evidence for the antiquity of the Torah, and I think that ketum amulets are actually very good evidence of that. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate that. Okay, Sentinel Apologetics, hi. Good to see you again. For $10 Australian. Thank you very much. Oh, Daddy Falk. In regards to Psalm 110, I came across studies on ancient Near Eastern iconography shows it reflects Egyptian and other ancient Near Eastern depictions of the king as a priest alongside the deity. Can you explain more? Well, there's a second one down there. Okay, so for a second $5 super chat, for example, check out JBL 2020 paper by Purcell. Quote, the king as royal priest imagery in Psalm 110 and ancient Near Eastern iconography. Okay, I can actually amplify on that a little. I'm just going to take a little refresher here of Psalm 110, is that? Yeah, Psalm 110. See, is that a big psalm or is that a short psalm? It's just a short psalm. Okay, so it's only seven verses. Psalm of David. The Lord says to my Lord, that's a very interesting thing right there. Sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet. The Lord will stretch forth thy strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of thy enemies. Thy people will encounter freely the day of thy power. In holy array from the womb of the dawn, thy youth are to thee as dew. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. Thou art a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at thy right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge among the nations. He will fill them with corpses. He will shatter the chief men over a broad country. He will drink from the brook by the wayside. Therefore, he will lift up his head. Yeah, there's a lot of royal symbolism here. A lot of it. The whole idea of, sitting at the right hand, making your enemies a footstool. Well, the footstool was used by kings, and we see this in, say, a lot of Egyptian antiquities. We find footstools in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. So yes, very common motif in the ancient Near East. Scepters, yes, we find scepters. That's royal imagery too. We find, for example, in the tomb of King Tut, both the crook and the flail, both of which were royal scepters. So absolutely, this royal imagery. Rule in the midst of thine enemies. Well, priests didn't rule, kings ruled. So this again is royal imagery. The people will volunteer freely in the day of thy power. Now, this one is very interesting. This one is very, very interesting because kings often had to conscript servants to get them to serve them. We find this, for example, in, say, when Solomon builds his palace. He has to conscript people to work on his royal palace. The people who worked on, say, the temple, Solomonic temple, were hired laborers, but conscription was a form of taxation. So what we're seeing here is a different kind of rulership. So volunteer freely is sort of an antithesis here of Solomonic transcript of that sort of royal conscription that kings back then used. Thou art a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek was both a king of Salem, which was at that time named Urushalem, the city of Salem, and he was a priest. And it's interesting, we're told that he's a priest of God, but we also know that Jerusalem originally served the god Shalem. So that's a very interesting little factoid there. Verse 5, he'll shatter the kings in the day of his wrath. There's power's going to be broken here. So again, all this is, like Egyptian kings defeating other kings. So yes, absolutely. He'll judge among the nations. He'll shatter the chief men over a broad company. You can revert to, say, the toponym list for this, where a king goes forth and conquers every single little town and hobble he encounters. He will drink from the brook by the wayside, therefore he will lift up his head. Again, the final victory of the king is a kingdom at peace. So absolutely, this is absolutely, Psalm 110 is replete with royal imagery, absolutely replete with it. So anyway, thank you very much for those super chats. Again, actually, it really helped for you to clarify that with the second super chat. So I hope that you found that interesting, and thank you very much. And it was good to see you again, old friend. Okay. Crucero Benny for Romanian 25. Thank you very much for super chat. Why didn't Joseph have his body buried in Canaan like Jacob? Might it be that Achmosa I conquered them and were under slavery or travel ban at least? Okay. We don't know exactly why Joseph didn't have his body buried in Canaan like he did for his father. It might have been, part of it might have been because at that point, Joseph was already no longer the vizier. Now, we have to understand that a vizier in Egypt is not a position for life. It's not a position for life. You're not appointed to vizier and rule the rest of your days as vizier. Viziers were appointed during the tenure of a king. And when a new king came to the throne, that king had the prerogative to replace his viziers at any time. So we don't actually know how long Joseph was vizier. We know at least 14 years. He was vizier for 14 years, but we don't know how much longer he was after that. So once a new king is installed and there's a new vizier, the descendants of Joseph would not have the escort. Because we have to remember that when Jacob was returned to the Holy Land, Joseph had an escort of chariots to ensure safe travel between Egypt and Canaan. Once Joseph was dead, he no longer had, the descendants of Joseph would not have had those resources available to him. So safe travel would probably not have been possible. So I think here what we have is a practical matter of how do you get an Egyptian body. Remember, a lot of mummification here included gold artifacts. So if you're traveling through Canaan, that's dangerous territory. And if you're carrying valuables, that makes it twice as dangerous. So I think that Achmosa I came to the throne and conquered Avaris after the death of Joseph. So I don't think I mean, there was a travel ban. Absolutely, there was a travel ban. We know that from, say, fortress excavations at the Road of Horus, particularly at Charu, that the influx of goods from Canaan sort of ceased after Achmosa the first, and didn't resume again until Tutmosis III. So there does seem to have been a sort of a shutting off of an embargo on travel between Canaan and Egypt for most of early Dynasty 18. But I think that happens after the death of Joseph. I think the real reason is the people of Israel just don't have the resources, the military resources, to ensure safe travel to and from Canaan. So anyway, that's what I think is going on there. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. $50 super chat from Kay. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very generous super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. Set was important to pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties. Absolutely. But he was portrayed as a chaotic trickster and usurper. It's a little different than that, but we'll get to that. Since Ma'at was so important to Egyptian society, why would the Ramesside kings want to be associated with him? Okay. We're going to have to backtrack just a little here. The whole idea of Ma'at being really, really important to Egyptian society was promoted by Jan Osman in some of his books. Now, Jan Osman is an Egyptologist, a very good one, actually. Yeah, I think he's deceased now, but he lived into his 90s. he wrote in German, and a lot of the translations of his German books became very, very popular in, say, more popular press here in America. And Jan Osman really promoted the idea of Ma'at as being sort of the central theme of Egyptian society. Well, as of, say, 2019, people have been researching is that claim really true? Is that claim really true? And I attended a conference paper that really made a compelling case to basically say that Ma'at was not nearly as central and really didn't become central in Egyptian culture until the reign of Seti I, which is in Dynasty 19. Prior to Dynasty 19, Ma'at really didn't play a role in Egyptian culture, religion, or society. It was a concept, but it didn't have that central role that we kind of think of it having. Now, we have to understand that part of what was happening in Dynasty 19 is there's a divide, a harsh religious divide between the Ramessides of Dynasty 19 and 20 and the Theban priesthood. The Theban priesthood is all about worshiping the Theban triad. Amun-Re, the goddess, mother goddess Mut, and the sun goddess Khonsu. That's what the Thebans' religion is all about. What the Ramessides are doing is they are setting their own theological agenda. And their theological agenda is very, very different than what we find in Thebes. The Ramessides aren't from Thebes. They're from Avaris. That's the land of Goshen. That's their native homeland. They're worshippers of Seth. They're worshippers of Ma'at. So we have to kind of put that in its sort of its context. Like, for example, when you look at, say, the names of kings are more than just a name. They're a religious agenda. They're a religious and ideological agenda. Seti the First's name is Men Ma'at Re. Re establishes Ma'at. But then his name is Seti, named after the god Set. So there's a religious agenda going on here. Now, Set himself is not a trickster. And he is portrayed as a usurper in, say, the Osirian myth, the myth of Osiris. And all this goes back to, say, the unification wars of, say, the first couple dynasties. But he's a storm god. He's essentially a storm god. And he more represents, in the 19th dynasty, he doesn't represent a chaotic trickster. And it's not chaos in, say, the sense of being, say, Dungeons and Dragons version of chaos. Or if you want to use the other literary allusion of the Elric of Melniboné, gods of chaos. He's not a god of chaos in that respect. He's more the god of unbridled power. So think of it more as say, chaos in the sense of an atomic bomb, where you've got this huge amount of power but no way to control it. So that's really more of what Seth represents in the 19th and 20th dynasties. Now, he's going to take on, say, a different illusion when we get to, say, the Third Intermediate Period, because it's going to change again, because mythology changes over time. In the Third Intermediate Period, he's going to start becoming associated with other things. He's going to become associated with the god Apopis. Apopis is going to be seen as a manifestation of Seth at that point, in a very tangential way. He's going to become associated with decay and other, say, sort of things that would attack, say, the apotheosis of the dead. But in the 19th and 20th dynasty, he's a god of power. He's a powerful god, and that's what that they're trying to portray here during, say, the dynasty 19, and that does fit in with Ma'at, but Ma'at is going to be, say, a balancing of power. So there's a whole ideological agenda going on here. So anyway, how the tension is actually achieved, that's another matter. But the kings are both here because, and here's going to be, I should explain this one other thing. What the kings are of Dynasty 19 and 20 are trying to do here with combining Ma'at and Seth is basically that the king is able to establish that Ma'at because he is powerful and has that power of Seth. So there is a logic here. There is a logic here, and there is a relationship. You just kind of got to read between the lines on it. So anyway, thank you for that great super chat. That was very generous. Very much appreciated. Thank you for that great question, too. Okay. Cataphract for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Any thoughts on the meteor that struck Tel El Haman? Any inspiration here for the destruction of Sodom? Okay. Almost no biblical archaeologists accept the idea that a meteor struck Tel El Haman. I have some really, really grave concerns about the whole excavation at Tel El Haman. There's some activity here that's bordering on illegal. I shouldn't say bordering, is illegal, such as allowing excavators there to take home pot shards. It's not illegal it's not legal to do that at Jordan. I have some problems with how Steve Collins interprets stratigraphy at Tel El Haman. I saw him on a video, talk about the stratigraphy at Tel El Haman, where he shows one destruction layer at the bottom and says, that's that destruction by the meteor, and then goes up 2 feet in the column and says, oh, this is a continuation of the same strata. No, that doesn't, stratigraphy doesn't work that way. You don't have a destruction layer, 2 feet of sediment, and then a second destruction layer above it. Stratigraphy doesn't work like that. I have a problem with the fact that the raw data isn't public. Like, for example, no field reports have been published on this. It's almost impossible to judge the quality of his work without field reports. That's very troubling. Experts on actual airbursts say this is nothing like an airburst, or even the fracturing of quartz. Experts on excavation, like Steve Ortiz, basically say that the destruction at Tel El Haman is not only not worse than other destructions like at Gezer, but it's actually less than what you find at like Gezer. Like Ortiz says, you see a much more destructive destruction layer at Gezer than you do at Tel El Haman. The dating is really hinky. This is now being dated to, say, the 1650s BC. Well, in the 1650s, you already have Joseph in Egypt. So there's huge problems with this identification of Tel El Haman as Sodom. So I'm really critical of this, and I was actually critical of this before even the start of the peer review stuff started coming out. There's even evidence that parts of this article had data doctored. Now that's cause for retraction right there, if justified, and it's looking like it's not looking good. So it would very much surprise me if at some point this article wasn't retracted because of manipulation of the data. When you see retraction, it's by a scientific journal. Just to be very clear here, it's usually for 2 reasons: plagiarism or fiddling with the data, making up the data, doctoring someone else's data, claiming someone presented some data that was wrong, making up, as I say, making up data. So there's issues with this article that are just, I think, really, really troubling, and I don't think this is something that, say, we should be backing, because it's just, it's flawed. It's methodologically flawed. The data's flawed. It's historically flawed. So I got real problems with this. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Tel El-Aman. Thank you for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Carusi Benny for 10 Romanian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Top 5 reasons Amenhotep III wasn't Exodus pharaoh. Let's see here. Well, there's a lot of reasons why Amenhotep III wasn't Exodus pharaoh. He had several campaigns into Canaan. That's gonna be a problem. We find his scarabs all over Canaan. So if you're kind of trying to make him out to be, he also lived. Let's see, what's the dating of this? He dates from Amenhotep III's dates are from 1389 to 1351 BC. His garrison towns are quite secure in Canaan. Yeah, I think we have, I mean, Avaris is, the Semitic portions of Avaris are still well occupied during Amenhotep III. We see continued occupation of Avaris by its Semitic population from essentially the beginning of Dynasty 18 all the way through the 19th dynasty. So, yeah, you're just, I don't think this is there's a credible case here to be made for Amenhotep III. So, that's my reasoning. I think the fact is that Ramses II makes a much more compelling case. Even the toponyms are just not going to help you here. Unless you start going into sort of a redaction criticism, and that's really a hard case. That's a hard case to make here. Given, say, how long that city survived. So, the idea that that Amenhotep III here was pharaoh of the Exodus, I don't think is a tenable case. Like, for example, the Bible mentions, say, the city of the fortress of Migdol. Well, Migdol was built by Seti I. So it's very hard to show that the Israelites were, pinned in by this city that didn't exist. And I think there's other examples of this too. We see a lot of Ramesside area toponymy in that's place names in the book of Exodus. So if we just take the Exodus narrative, absence of any other, say, considerations, we get a Ramesside context. So I think that has to weigh very, very heavily in our thinking here. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Hope that answered your question. Okay. Sentinel Apologetics for another $5 Australian. Thank you very much, Robert. Popcorn time. Oh, didn't I get into enough trouble with the last popcorn video? Have mercy on me. Our friend Petro writes, quote, Pharaoh's name means double-minded. What? How does he get that? The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, meaning limiting God. Do I laugh? Yes, you should laugh. Warrior, was I laugh out loud? Yes, the Hebrew is Mitzrayim. Now, the whole thing about Mitzrayim is it's very interesting. Let's talk about Mitzrayim for a second here. The Hebrew word is actually common Semitic. This is a common Semitic word. We find it in Akkadian. So already in Akkadian documents, Egypt is known as Mizri. And all it means is Egypt. It has nothing to do with limiting God. I don't know where he gets this from. This is like cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. He's quoted. Okay, let's see. All right.
Egypt means to limit God.
All right. I've got the super chat up for another $10 Australian super chat. Quote: Pharaoh, meaning to limit God, was ruled by Pharaoh, whose name means double-minded. Those who are double-minded will always be in darkness, and they will be unstable in their ways. Okay, I think I know where he's getting this from. Now, this is Gnostic exegesis. Essentially, this is allegorical method being applied. Now, what he's doing is he's basically saying he's looking at, say, how the Hebrew terminology for Mitzrayim is. The Mitzrayim is in the dual in Hebrew. So when you see a dual in Hebrew, it means two things. It means that there's a pair of something, a natural pair. Like, for example, hands. You never talk about hands in the plural. You always talk about hands in the dual, unless you mean hands cut off as war trophies. But hands on a natural person is a dual, because you have two of them. Feet, eyes, two of each. Mitzrayim is also in the dual. And there's actually a logical reason why it's in the dual in Hebrew. And that's because it's the two countries, Upper and Lower Egypt. The king of Egypt is the lord of the two lands. So Hebrew is actually reflecting, say, the Egyptian idea of kingship here and land. But Mitzri itself, we do find it typically in the singular in, say, Akkadian documents. In Ugaritic documents, we also find it. So there's nothing here that gives, there's no etymology here that reflects the mindedness. This is a out in left field sort of, ancient aliens kind of interpretation. It's just crazy, but he's kind of leveraging that dual etymology of Mitzrayim and then adding extra meaning on there that's not in the text. There's really no question of where the etymology is. It's just common Semitic. In fact, even today, the Semitic of Mitzri is in Arabic. If you go to Egypt, you'll see on, say, as you come into the country, welcome to the Republic of Mizr. Well, that's just the Arabic name of Egypt. And where did the Arabic name come from? Common Semitic. So this is just a common Semitic terminology being used here. So anyway, thank you for those super chats. Sorry you have to deal with this guy. Wow. Yeah. It's allegorical method. It's totally allegorical method. And with an allegorical method, you can add any story you want to anything. You can just manipulate things. It doesn't have to have any basis, in fact. So thank you very much for the super chats. Okay, Lance for $6.99 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. How did you know what you wanted to study in university? Also, when did you become a Christian? Been wondering. Thought balloon. Okay. I became a Christian at age 7. I essentially grew up in a Christian family. And basically after one night of at evening church, it just sort of kind of hit me that, yeah, becoming a Christian was the right thing to do. And at that point, I gave my life to Christ in the backseat of a car on the way home from church that night. So I was 7. I was a very, very reflective and deep child. In many ways, I was a humorless child, to be honest. That's changed. Now I'm a kind of a lark as an adult. But that was how I came to Christ. Now, how did you know what you wanted to study in university? Well, I went to university. When I went to university, I started off in the natural sciences. I started off actually majoring in biochemistry. because I was a real science geek in high school, real science geek. I did, and that actually, for the first 2-3 years of my university, I was actually in the physical sciences. And I learned a lot. I mean, I was a great foundation for other things. But what happened was, I didn't do so well. I didn't do so well. I found that calculus was not something that I had a natural aptitude towards. And I was not quite prepared for, say, the rigors of scientific training at a major university. So I didn't do so well, and I had to do some remedial courses. So I was sort of in that spot where I had taken too many sciences. Taken so many that when I had to take the remedial course, I couldn't take more science. So it's at that point I kind of had to branch off into the humanities to sort of, you know, redeem myself. So I took a variety of things. I took philosophy. I took psychology. I took ancient Near Eastern studies. I took fine art. And I found I loved philosophy. I absolutely loved philosophy, and I loved archaeology. Absolutely loved it. So it was actually in my university training that I discovered, hey, you know, these are subjects I find really, really interesting. So that's how I discovered what I wanted to study, was actually by going and studying. So, and it made sense because, you know, when I was at university, you know, early on, I had this access to this 2 million volume library at the University of British Columbia. And man, the stuff I kept reading was stuff on archaeology, stuff on Egyptology, hieroglyphs. You know, this is the stuff I was really, really interested in actually reading. So somebody should have taken me aside way early on and said, hey, you should pursue what you like to read. But I didn't have the value of that advice because in many respects, I'm a first generation college graduate. My parents did not go to university. My grandparents did not go to university. I'm the first person in my family to hold a PhD. So I had to learn many things the hard way here. It is a lot easier if you have parents that have already gone through the process because they can really help you. But I was kind of coming from a blue collar working class family. I had to figure a lot of this out for myself. So anyway, that's how I figured it out. That's how I discovered it. And God is using it for his glory. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, RG Strategy for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. In 2 Kings 17:4, who was So king of Egypt? I've seen in a book Who's Who in Ancient Near East that Orsorkon IV. Yes, it's Orsorkon IV. And we get that because of the relative datings of the kings. Now, I'm gonna pull up here that verse because it's always good to quote the verse directly. 2 Kings 17 verse 4. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hosea, who sent a message to So, king of Egypt, that had offered no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. So the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. If we look at, say, the dating for Hosea, what we get is he reigns just taking a moment to look him up here for a moment. Let's see, that's the House of David. He reigns around, let's see, make sure I got the right one here, is 731 to 722 BC. We look at, say, the kings of say, the third intermediate period. We know that the nickname for Osorkon IV was So that much we already know. But we have to also look at the dates, see if they're compatible here. So we see Osorkon's the dates 728 to 713. So Osorkon lives at the very end of Hosea's reign. And actually lives a little while longer into before his dynasty is ultimately toppled also. So what happens is so this Hosea makes that appeal to Egypt, and frankly, Osokan IV is not in any position to respond because his own dynasty is falling to bits. Because at the same time as the kingdom of Israel is falling to the Assyrians, the kingdom of Egypt is falling to the Nubians. And it's that Osokan IV where we see that transition, say, from Dynasty 25 to, Dynasty 22 to Dynasty 25. So it's definitely Osokan IV. So thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Brian Peachy for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is the correct meaning of Elohim in Exodus 21:6? Is there any Egyptian context? Well, let's look at Exodus 21:6 and see. Exodus 21. Okay, this happens to be the passage of the bondservant. So, Exodus 21:6, I'll start at verse 5 here to give context here. But if a slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then his master shall bring him to God. This is the word Elohim. And then he shall bring him to the doorpost, the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Okay, now, this passage is debated. The question is, you do have the question is, first of all, is this God or gods? That question is going to come up constantly in this passage. Because, frankly, if in the original text the vowel points are not there, so there is some latitude here to interpret this either as God or gods, and we've already raised this a little in a previous super chat tonight, where we talked about the difference between, say, Elohim as being just the plural of El, or the magnificent plural meaning the great God. Now, we don't know here. The question is this the temple? Well, this is not the temple. This is pre-temple. This is tabernacle period. So it's not a reference to the temple. I know there's some people who try to make this suggestion that, oh, this is a later date writing because the slave is being brought to the temple and his ears being pierced there. I don't think it necessarily means that. And I think what's going on here is more of, say, a vow. So bring the slave to maybe before a Levite who can administer the vow. So I'm much more. There's another super chat here that is up here, but I don't think what's I'm going to actually reference this super chat because I am going to actually take some issue with this, which is Sentinel Apologetics says Heiser thinks Elohim in Exodus 21:6 are teraphim. I don't think they're teraphim. No, I don't think they're teraphim. I think teraphim are something else. Teraphim are household deities, and I know why Heiser's driving at this, but I also think it's misguided. Their teraphim are household deities. They're sexual deities. I don't think that's what's going on here. They're fertility deities, essentially, is what teraphim are. I don't think that's what's happening there. And because for a bondservant, why would you need the teraphim to intervene here? It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to me that this would be teraphim. I think what's more going on here is that the bringing before God is bringing before a Levite, essentially, a Levite who has to administer a vow, because we have to remember that in every little town in the nation of Israel, Levites are supposed to be there acting in a pastoral role. So Levites not only are supposed to be teachers, but they're also supposed to be religious administrators. They're supposed to be officiants. Basically, you know, bless weddings, collect the fee for the firstborn. You know, the five shekel, or the shekel a redemption fee. You know, the Levites are supposed to fill in all these little responsibility. Yeah. Sentinel Apologetics adds here, Heiser thinks that Elohim in Exodus 21:6 are, or sorry, that wasn't the one. Heiser thinks that, but Heiser thinks Teraphim equals dead house ancestors. Yeah, again, I'm not convinced. This one I'm not convinced on. Part of my thinking goes here into is that a paper I heard from Lawson Younger, who did a large, a very, very substantial paper on the Teraphim. And he references here the role of Teraphim across Aramaic literature. And Teraphim are household gods. I mean, I don't think they can be ancestral gods. Absolutely, no question about that. They are ancestral gods. They're also fertility deities. Because we do find them used in bedchambers. You know, not just in say the private altars, but in bedchambers. So, I think wow. So I don't think Heiser's correct here. So this is why I have issues with his interpretation of Exodus 21:6 here. Is I think that what's really going on here is that the Levite is being the local representative for Elohim, and as the local representative, he has to witness. He has to witness the vow. Because, you know, if you don't have that witness, how do you know that the bondservant really made the vow? Because one of the things about the bondservant vow is you can't get out of it once you go into it. It's a covenant. It's really, really a covenant. It's a treaty between master and slave. Because after, say, the year of Jubilee, an Israelite slave is free to leave. He's absolutely released from his slavery, and he can go. Nothing is holding him back. His family, his marriage, his kids, he can leave all of that behind him and start anew as a free person. So when we talk about, say, the vow a bondservant has to take, it's a serious business. He's basically giving up forever his right to go free. Well, this is how we see all these sorts of little laws in the book of Exodus, in Deuteronomy, even in Leviticus, where a Levite has to come in and inspect or verify something happens. We see this, for example, in, say, when a house is infected with a fungus, black mold or something like that, where a Levite comes in, or a priest comes in and looks at the house and says, yeah, condemned. The owner has the right to clean it up, and then the priest or Levite has to come back and say, oh yeah, okay, it's safe to live in now. Yeah. But the priest has to verify it. The Levite has to verify it. So what we have here is the role of the Levites is the role of verifiers. So I think what's happening in, say, 21:6 is that the slave is being brought to a Levite or a priest, but essentially before God. Somebody who will witness it in the same way that married or engaged couples goes before God and gets married. I mean, with a marriage, we still use this use of the couple going before God and saying their vows. We still say this. So, in the case of, say, a marriage, we don't say, well, the priest married him. No, normally. I mean, we do in, say, maybe more Catholic circles because the priest is given the proxy power of God. But say in more Protestant circles, what we say in, say, a marriage is that God made the union between male and female. The priest is just there to sort of supervise it, supervise the ceremony. And I think that's what's happening here, is that the priest is there to supervise the giving of the bondservant vow, so that it's a vow before God, it's irrevocable, and then the master is then justified to continue treating this person as a slave, as a bondservant at that point. So I think that's what's going on there. We don't see, to answer your second question there, is there any Egyptian context? Not really. Egyptian slaves could be freed, but they're usually not, there's no, say, jubilee in Egypt, so there's no automatic release of slaves. So you don't find this situation coming up in Egypt very often. We do find, though, that the idea of a bondservant, where people have sold themselves into slavery, we do find in Egypt the occasional idea that a slave was freed and then came back as a bondservant. So it did happen. It was a lot more rare in Egypt because being freed as a slave was a lot more rare too. So I hope that answers your super chat. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate. And I do want to thank Robert for bringing up Heiser's interesting views here as well. So I want to recognize his super chats and thank him for those. But this is what undergirds my view here. So I think with that is all the super chats. I will try to take a couple more normal questions regular questions before we call it a night. And start in a random place here and then scroll through. Let's see here. Actually going to take this one here. So now I got a non-super chat here from we'll get to that one in a moment. From Azar Kazam Sakan. Hopefully I pronounced that close to right. What books can you recommend to start learning about the ancient Near East? And are there some tips that you can recommend to identify if an academic paper or book sources are good or bad? Okay. Oh, this is the... okay, I'm going to answer that last one first because that one is actually the trickiest bit. Understanding sources is really specialty knowledge. Very, very difficult for sort of somebody who hasn't done a lot of this work to identify good versus bad sources. This is why a lot of people who have just, say, even master's degrees in the ancient Near East get into trouble sometimes when they try to publish papers. because they don't have a good understanding about quality of sources. It's really, really difficult to judge quality of sources unless you've done a lot of this work. I don't have any specific guidance here for you, except to say if it's something, say, more fringe or, say, popular press, it's probably not as good. But this is really, really difficult to tell unless you've done a lot of work in it. So I can't give you a lot of good things here. Now, your first question. What books can you recommend to start learning about the ancient Near East? I don't have it here at my side, of course, but the background, behind the scenes of the Old Testament, I think it's published in 2019 or 2020, is a very, very good book on, say, biblical history, on the ancient Near Eastern context of the Bible. It's excellent. I'll say Richard Hess's book on Israelite religion is excellent. If you want to go sort of deep into, say, the documents themselves that are, form the context, there's always Lawson Younger's Context of Scripture for ancient Egypt. The great sort of beginner book on this is Ian Shaw's Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. So there's several books there, the books by what's his name now? John Walton are very good too. I'll also highly recommend John Walton's books. His books tend to be a little more specialized, but they are very good. They are very, very good. So there's about 3 or 4 books there that are just really excellent, that can give you a good start here. There's some books on, say, Mesopotamia, I think by Alan Millard, that are also very good. So there's a lot of excellent books out there. So those are the ones I recommend off the top of my head. And all of those were written by really responsible scholars. So thank you very much for the super chat, or sort of not for the non-super chat. The question, it's a good question, and thank you very much. Okay. Sentinel Apologetics for $2 Australian. Thank you for the super chat. Is that a Scotch glass? Well, yes, technically it is a Scotch glass. It's right now full of water. Wish it was full of Scotch, but right now it's full of water. I do drink Scotch. I am a devotee of whiskey, and I make no apologies for that. I actually very much enjoy whiskey, so I do partake. But yes, it is a Scotch glass. It's right now full of water. The coffee cup is full of coffee. So that answers your super chat. You asked. Yeah, now you're making me crave Scotch, especially Lefroy. Like Lefroy. Can't afford it, but I like it. Okay. Brian Peachy for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thanks. What about Deuteronomy 25:5? Is it referring to cult practice? Is the verse supposed to fit the context of the verses surrounding it? Well, that's usually a general rule that most verses do fit the context around them. So this is just reading something contextually. So let's see what 22:5 says, and we'll take a little bit of the context here. Okay. I will read 4 to 6. Now, you shall see, verse 4, you shall not see your countryman's donkey or his fallen ox down on the way, and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly help them to raise them up. A woman shall not wear man's clothes, nor shall man put on woman's clothing, for whoever does this thing is an abomination to the Lord your God. And this is one of those very very strong language. This is very strong language in Hebrew. Toevo, it means abomination. It's the strongest condemnation that you find in Hebrew. Verse 6, if you happen to come across a bird's nest along the way in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, the mother sitting on the young eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. Okay, so what we have here is essentially a set of sundry laws. Now, there is a theme to these laws, and it's a theme where, how do I explain this? It's trying to get the Israelites into a sort of what's called antithetical thinking. Okay. Basically, one of the things that, Israelite culture is surrounded on all sides by nations that have a variety of religious practices. So one of the things that these laws are trying to do is get the Israelites into a mode of black and white thinking, right and wrong, dividing things into categories. Those categories are holy, clean, unclean, abomination, or toivo. So there's this attempt here to try to sort of not make sure the lines are as clear as possible, so that people are ritually acceptable for worship to God. Essentially, the way this early Israelite religion worked was, if you're going to worship God, you've got to do it God's way. So, for example, we do find, like, for example, you see the treatment of animals here. How you treat your countryman's ox, the beginning of Deuteronomy 22. You shall not see your countryman's ox or sheep straying away. Pay no attention to them, certainly bring them back in the country. And that goes with the pericope that goes all the way to verse 4. Then you see nested, a woman shall not wear man's clothing, followed by the bird's nest, and then, you shall let the mother go free. So there is the sandwiching of commandments. And one of the reasons we find the sandwiching of commandments is because in some respects, your attitude towards the one is going to affect the other. The idea of taking eggs when the mother is sitting on them. Okay, this also, we also see this, for example, in the law that says you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And it really is not. Really isn't supposed to be the whole sort of, say, what's later interpreted as kosher, that you can't mix dairy and meat. That's not the purpose of that. The purpose of that law is to prevent barbarism. That's what the purpose is. That you don't do something that's unnatural. So the whole idea here is that the theme of this is unnatural acts. Okay? The whole idea of Israelites is you are supposed to be here living with your brothers, your distant clan relations. So it's not natural for you to steal a brother's ox that has wandered away. It's not natural for you to steal the eggs of a bird when it's nesting it. So those two sort of outside extremities are then sandwiching, well, it's not natural for a woman to wear man's clothing or a man to wear woman's clothing. So there's really there is really a sort of a stressor here. It's cumulative. It's amplifying language. It's amplifying language. It's meant to amplify it. So that's why you're supposed to, when you read this, you're supposed to read this in context. It's because you're supposed to get the amplification out of this. So anyway, I hope that explains what's happening in Deuteronomy 22, and it should explain at least from verse 1 to, say, verse 9 here. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Hey, how's it going? So Heather Newt for $2. Thank you for the super chat. Thanks for your PM response. May Ma'at prevail. You are most welcome. Very, very, very glad we can, you know, enlighten, educate. We are it's our job here on this channel to make things clearer, to really sort of bring evidence out, bring recent archaeological findings, go into the scholarly literature. Just, you know, we serve, and this is how we serve, is by answering questions. So you're most welcome. It's our pleasure, and thank you very much for the super chat. It really helps our channel. We can't do it without support from people like you, so very much appreciated. Okay, I'm going to take one more non-super chat, and then we're going to call it a night. Okay, I've answered a lot of his questions, so I'm going to try to find somebody here who I haven't found answered yet. Okay, I'm going to take Warrior of the Most High. Okay, his question is, I recently heard that the Great Pyramid of Giza was not built by slaves. Is that true? Absolutely. It was not built by slaves. Mark Leaner has basically excavated the workman's village at Giza. And these were the craftsmen that built the Great Pyramid. In fact, these are the craftsmen that built all 3 pyramids, and a good portion of the Queen's pyramids, as well as the most royal mastabas at Giza. And we know from the workman's village that it held about 10,000 people. And the interesting things we find at Giza we find at the workman's village is we find medical supplies. There's fragments of bandages, of sewing needles, when sewing needles were actually used to suture wounds, just like they're used today. So they had medical supplies. We also find of something very, very interesting too is remnants of beef, particularly the thigh bones of cattle. And what's so interesting about this is that these bones were used in a specific recipe in ancient Egypt, and still used in modern Egypt. Today it's called knucklebone soup. It's knucklebone soup. Essentially what they would do is they would drill holes into these thigh bones and make this high protein, high mineral soup out of them. So we've got these remains. They dried fish. They had wine. They probably had olive oil too. These are food supplies you just don't give slaves. Slaves did not have access to beef. Slaves did not have access to medical supplies. So what we see here is that the pyramid builders at Giza were not a slave class. They were a craftsman class, essentially. And we find other workmen's villages also around Egypt too. I think the other real famous one is at Deir el-Medina. We also have a lot of ostraca from Deir el-Medina. We also have now papyri from, say, the building of the pyramids at Giza as well. All this indicates that they were craftsmen, essentially highly skilled, highly trained experts in building pyramids, building tombs. They were very efficient at it. They were very treasured at it. And really, that village at Giza survives until they're sort of relocated to, say, Saqqara. So, yeah, absolutely. The consensus thinking right now is and pretty much this is pretty much settled in Egyptology that slaves were not responsible for the building of pyramids. they were responsible for, say, the building of, it was basically craftsmen that built the pyramids of Giza. Now, we do find some slave involvement in building, say, later pyramids of, say, the 6th dynasty and the Middle Kingdom, but that's more because of mud brick. And the slaves were not involved in the construction of the pyramid, but in the manufacture of the mud brick that made up the pyramids. But that pretty much is all the involvement slaves had in the construction of pyramids. And that's just because the craftsmen were just more efficient and they did it a lot better. Essentially, it was a matter of more of competency and skill than anything else. So thank you very much for that question. Interesting question. I hope you found that interesting too. So it is 10 o'clock right now, and we are going to call it a night. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. Very interesting set of questions tonight. We got into some really deep stuff tonight. I think this was a really great set of super chats and questions tonight. Again, I want to thank everyone who provided a super chat and contributed to our operations on the channel. We can't do it without you. We really appreciate it, and we're so grateful. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our regular subscribers. I also want to thank our Patreon supporters. We do really appreciate everyone who supports us on Patreon. Again, it helps us make ends meet, pay the bills, as it were. And they're also a very valuable source of feedback, and we get a lot of ideas for videos from our Patreon subscribers. So I want to also thank them as well. So with that, I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. It was very early chat said it was party time, and tonight felt like a party. So anyway, thank you very much, and have a good night. I'll see you next week on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.